Hi there. Let's chat for just a bit about the recommendations to change the landscape in terms of GIS education around the world. Well, you know, Rogers' 1995 theory on the diffusion of innovations begins with innovators who are followed by early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and finally the laggards. Has the global GIS education community passed the innovations phase, if you know what I mean, and arrived at early adoption? The answer to this question has implications for how teacher professional development needs to be conducted and whether GIS in education has enough internal momentum without requiring external support. The spread of GIS beyond higher education into secondary education may represent a tipping point, if you will, that increases the rate of diffusion into the rest of education, formal and informal. However, despite the fact that GIS in secondary education is in its third decade, it is still largely ignored by the majority of secondary educators. Without external support mechanisms and reforms, I argue, our community argues, that GIS is likely to remain a tool only for the innovators and early adopters. What are those mechanisms and reforms that I'm talking about? Well, I believe that several key things need to happen to advance the use of GIS in education. First, educators must publicize what they are doing for other teachers, students, and school administrators, which achieved great success in South Africa, for example, as evidenced in a recent book that my colleagues and I have written. Analyzing 21st century issues from the spatial perspective is, I believe, simply too important to hide away in one discussion at the back of the school. Second, I recommend that those involved with GIS in education conduct teacher face-to-face and online professional development. For example, in Taiwan, over 1,000 students attended GIS workshops by 2009. Participation in these workshops was key in ensuring that spatial information and GIS are included in standardized college entrance exams and in a higher percentage of high schools than anywhere else in the world, to my knowledge. Third, higher education must take an active role in promoting and supporting GIS in education at the secondary level, including through professional development, curriculum development, and research. The GIS industry needs to re-examine its pricing policy. Time after time, what I hear around the world is that the prohibitive cost of GIS software is mentioned as being out of reach for a lot of secondary schools. Fifth, and even more importantly, I encourage educational reform that supports inquiry-based methods throughout primary and secondary education. Yet reform needs to be supported throughout universities to achieve the kind of workforce that industry, nonprofit organizations, and government organizations are demanding. Momentum from inquiry-based education can be quickly lost at the university level if students are once again relegated after graduating from high school and entering those universities to once again memorizing and taking exams. Perhaps the best example of collaborative partnerships for reform I know of comes from the Netherlands. One of the main textbooks for secondary geography education there in 2003 included a chapter on GIS, followed by a Dutch version of Arc Explorer Java Edition for Education, or EDGE, lessons and data sets. Around the same time, a WebGIS entitled Bos Atlas Online allowed students to create maps and charts in an online environment, and a portal called edugis.nl was developed through cooperative efforts between government agencies, research institutes, teachers, teacher training institutes, and textbook publishers. EduGIS began providing data, lessons, workshops, and courses, providing key workforce skills. As geographic information systems evolved into GI science 20 years ago, GIS in education now has its own research base, developers, and educators who advance its theory and practice through research, curriculum, and teaching. The research is anchored in geographic education, yet incorporates elements of experiential learning, problem-based learning, and elements of cognitive science. The GIS in education bibliography reached over 2,000 entries by the end of 2012, with an increasing number of theses and dissertations. However, the GIS educational landscape remains small. Educational policymakers and administrators demand evidence that clearly shows how and why the use of any technology or method makes a difference in student learning. I therefore advocate as my sixth recommendation that a multi-year international GIS in education virtual research center be established to promote and support research that is desperately needed in this field. It would accomplish what NCGIA did, National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, did for GI science back in 1990, an established research base that develops GIS-based curricular efforts, teacher training programs, and advocacy documents well grounded in learning theory. Turkey provides, I think, one of the best models for the impact that a large study could have. In order to identify problems before implementing GIS-based project at schools there, a study was conducted through the support of the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey, involving 300 students, many teachers, and 3 public high schools. Such projects could provide a good template for a global study of GIS in education. In Austria, for example, Thomas Jekyll and others described a program where teachers are paid to conduct research. Could this model be a valuable component in such a GIS education research center?